Kia ora, Aotearoa, and hello world. You are listening to the Yeah Nah podcast, the official podcast of the New Zealand Skeptics. I'm Bronwyn Rideout, and back for yet another week of random and also not so random skeptical discussion are my co-hosts, Mark Honeychurch.
Oh god, yeah, I'm back again, aren't I?
Yep, this is a perpetual motion machine over here, and Katrina Borthwick.
Hello.
And we have two special guests joining us. First is Lee Traynor. Lee is the generous sponsor of our youth scholarships for both the upcoming New Zealand and Australian Skeptics Conference. And we're going to be talking about those scholarships as well as learning a little bit more about Lee later in the podcast. Also, we welcome back James Kerr. James is not a first-time caller, not a first-time listener, and he is going to be talking about some pseudo-economic beliefs. Is that right?
That's right.
We still have our sights set on the stars again, because at least two of our three regular contributor segments are going to be about space. Katrina, going to educate us a little bit about space junk and whether it's really going to take out our internet. And Mark has investigated reactionless space shuttle propulsion. But before we get into any of that, Mark, why don't you talk about your select committee chat?
Yeah, I had an oral submission with a select committee on Monday. Only found out about it on the weekend, so not long to prepare. But this was not for the skeptics, this was for the NZARH, and it was about the modern slavery bill. There's a bunch of bills coming up that have some kind of relevance to skepticism, humanism, etc. And this one, the NZARH had put a submission in, and as I'm a council member, connected to Zoom at far too early on a Monday morning, 9:30, and yeah, myself and Sarah Passmore, who used to be a committee member of the Skeptics, we each talked for a few minutes just about two different aspects of modern slavery. Mine was about the fact that, and James, this you'll be able to tell me whether I'm right with this one, but Crown immunity, right? So the government cannot fine itself?
Governments have sovereign immunity, which means that they can simply refuse to be sued for things if they don't want to be sued for them.
Yeah, so the idea from what I read was that, like, part of it is that if you're shuffling money from one department to another department, how much of a punishment really is it? But with this bill, the government had excluded itself. It had had an exemption for itself from these financial punishments because of this immunity, but what it hadn't done is thought about how it could put in an alternative, whether there could be any other kind of driver to make sure that government agencies were following the law. And it's only, like for business, it's only any business that makes over $100 million a year needs to kind of keep an eye on whether its supply chain has modern slavery in it, both locally and internationally. So I talked about how maybe the ombudsman or maybe a regulator would be enough that, you know, they could police government agencies. Sarah had the much more interesting part, which was talking about how this relates to religion. So part of that is forced marriage and child marriage and how children can often end up finding themselves in slavery conditions after being forcibly married, but also and even adults who are kind of forced into working for very low wages or for free when they're in religious organizations, especially cults. And Vale is our textbook example in this country of a cult group that we know is very exploitative of its women, who from a very early age gets them to work long hours, like getting up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and preparing food for the entire community. But not only that, not only working on the internal stuff, but also running profit-making businesses for Gloria Vale. You know, there are a bunch of businesses that the cult runs, and they don't seem to have much of a problem with getting children and other people to work unpaid for their profit-making organizations.
I guess I'm kind of interested in, putting together bills. We've done this before as a skeptics committee. So when you're submitting a submission for the bill, sometimes you can, as you did, talk to the select committee. But what happens if maybe skeptics want to make a submission but don't want to talk? What can they do?
So when you put in your submission, there's usually a box that you can tick saying whether you want to give an oral submission as well. When it's a hot topic, they won't be able to talk to everyone, so they try and pick kind of organizations and also individuals that I think are kind of known to have a high quality opinion or have put in a high quality submission. So you're not even guaranteed if you want to give an oral submission. One way to kind of almost make sure you don't is just to copy and paste something off the internet. I believe they tend to staple those together and just take a note of the quantity of the same submission they got. But as long as your submission is substantially different and is interesting enough, there's a good chance that you'll be asked to give an oral submission.
I think we have, well, as of today, I think we're down to 8 bills that are going to be going through within the next 23 days. Thank you, Mark. The next thing I did want to chat a little bit about is I wrote the second part of my article about AG1, the green powder that was run by a Kiwi, Chris Ashenden. I finally got the chance to finish the Powder Keg podcast that was put together by the Newsroom, co-produced by Jonathan Milne and Mike Wesley Smith. It looks at Chris Ashenden's issues with the New Zealand court, as well as actually reaching out to some of the families who were impacted by that rent-to-own scheme. The story is still a little bit vague about how Chris got into the supplement business, but there's a point that's dropped, or a family fact that's dropped like a bit of a hot potato, and that's the fact that Chris Ashenden is the nephew of Jeff Ashenden, who was the former director of Newzest. Does anyone here know what Newzest is?
Nope.
Okay, so it's another New Zealand supplement company. They do the Good Greens green powder drink. So that's actually something that's actually on New Zealand grocery shelves within the health food section or in health food stores. It's another green powder drink. This time, rather than 75 ingredients, it has like 77 or 78. There's some similarities in the formulation, but it's not exact. But it's also significantly cheaper than AG1.
Yeah, it was really interesting, Bronwyn, to read your article because it gave me very much a flashback to your MLM articles, like the breakdown of the ingredients and all that kind of thing, how much of the ingredients are in the product in reality. And it sounds like it's all a little bit fast and loose when they come to making this powder.
So as it was explained in the podcast, basically they have about 3 different ingredient mixes. So the first mix that goes in is all their very expensive but low quantity mixes. So maybe this is like 100 grams. So not even quite a cup, depending on what the supplement or the powder or the mix that's going in. So maybe 100 grams for 5 or 6 of the ingredients.
And that's in like a metric ton or more?
1 metric ton. So that's like a 1 million grams. So 100 grams put into as part of a 1 million gram mix. So when you think about the formulation, they keep the formulations quite secret as, on the grounds of secrecy, proprietary blends. But some of those ingredients, you wouldn't even get like 0.001 of a gram on a daily basis, if at all.
So you're microdosing on some of these ingredients then?
Yeah. But even the bigger ingredient amounts aren't really exact. Again, one of the things they said in the podcast is that they find potentially big bags of the larger quantity ingredients, like maybe the spirulina, the pea flour, or the barley, when they're doing their end of day reconciliation. So they would just toss it into whatever mix was left. As was claimed in the podcast, or by, I would say, maybe former employees who were interviewed. That was the claims that they were making. It was interesting how they went about investigating some of the science, reaching out to various dietitians and scientists. Really cool for them to go to the University of Mississippi and talk to their natural food products lab and have the powder analyzed. They weren't able to analyze for the presence of all 70 ingredients or 77 ingredients. They were only able to do 45. They were able to determine that and this is sort of the good news, is that no nasty stuff, no unexpected ingredients were in the mix, but there were ingredients missing. Like some of your premium or very, very expensive ingredients were missing from at least the product that Milne had when he sent it to the lab. To be honest, my interest kind of fell away around the end because I just wasn't as interested in their trip to South America, trying to catch up or meet with Ashenden in person to ask him all these questions. But I really did feel for Milne and his co-producer Wesley Smith, because apparently they got scooped. Now, in the part 1 of my article, and when I talked about it last time on the podcast, I mentioned a really great video by Scott Carney. In the Powder Keg podcast, apparently the claim that was made is that Milne was talking to Carney while they were both doing the same investigation, and then Carney took everything that Milne found out about Ashenden's court cases in New Zealand and put it up on the YouTube video.
That sounds a bit cheeky.
I don't remember if Carney actually gave them credit in any way, but it may have actually worked out in their favor because, well, do you think the newsroom would have been able to withstand a legal battle or a threatened lawsuit from AG1? Because they got a very, very good defamation lawyer. AG1 did.
Right.
But apparently, they were able to put out the video, so I don't know if she clearly wasn't successful in her counterclaims.
Yeah, but so they went after the first person to break the story, which wasn't the podcast, it was the YouTube video.
Yeah, but the YouTube video was able to go up because, again, there's clearly enough evidence that nothing they said was defamation. And again, I guess the one thing that was funny, and this will be my last point about this podcast, is that at least 3 times you will have David Farrier, quote unquote, quoted. They'll play a clip from his Flightless Bird podcast when he was doing ad reads for AG1.
Oh my god, we gave him Skeptic of the Year. Why is nobody perfect? Why can't we have somebody that does everything wrong?
Mm-hmm. But there seems to have been a bit of back and forth. Farrier did write an article about it saying that he kind of felt that Milne misrepresented the intent of initially reaching out to Farrier, because all he was sort of asking Farrier was like, why do you believe this about AG1, blah, 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 blah. And when Farrier responded, Milne's response was, oh, did you know about this crime? So I don't think Farrier felt very good about that. But then Milne just ended up using the clip of the ad read at least 3 times. I said 3 times in that podcast. And each time it was focusing on a different aspect of the claim, such as, it's made in New Zealand. It's green. I like it. And the whole irony of this entire thing is that now that they're actually selling the product in New Zealand, it's too late because the product had been made in New Zealand for so long, yet not sold. And I think they're really only selling in New Zealand now that they're trying to regain some customers post-controversy, and no one's really interested.
Right. So how come they weren't selling in New Zealand? So while they were making it in New Zealand, they just didn't sell it here?
People were able to get it, but you'd have to, use that secondary post office, like you give those companies an address over in Australia or in America, and then it would be forwarded by New Zealand Post, even though the company could not directly send it to New Zealand.
Yeah.
I don't really know what was going on. I guess it must have something to do with regulations regarding the sale of these products or whatever ingredients, or getting some approval for the formulations, because the formulations do vary based on market. So the New Zealand formulation is different than what's sold in the US.
Yeah, so that has selenium, which apparently we have a lack of, whereas the US was something different.
So yeah, long story short, watch the Powder Cake podcast. There's some really interesting science that they talk about. We get a pretty good pro-science opinion about supplements.
They don't just take the business angle, they look at the kind of skeptical, does it work angle as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we move on to our main segments, it's again my pleasure to introduce Lee Traynor. As we said at the top of the hour, Lee is a generous patron of both the New Zealand and Australian Skeptics conferences. Lee is generously sponsoring several scholarships for both conferences so that people can go see the SGU. So Lee, welcome to the podcast. Again, thank you for your generous donation of these scholarships. We want to know a little bit more about who you are, and actually hearing about this new foundation that you have founded through which the scholarships are being sponsored for, because I think Mark and I know you personally. You've come to our conferences in the past. You certainly do come every now and then to Skeptics in the Pub when you can. And the foundation has been something that you've had going on or thinking about for quite a while.
So I taught English at a German university for the last 25 years, and that was teaching students of science, engineering, maths and physics, basically science communication and critical thinking. So at the end of the last decade, I was planning my retirement, which came in November of last year. And I was thinking of moving back to Australia, and I knew my pension date and that I could get my pension paid out, my German pension paid out in Australia. And I was thinking then about some financial planning so that I could get all of that done. And into the mix, there was a pandemic of sorts that was very interesting. And it certainly made me think about the question of what if I don't survive the pandemic? Plenty of people didn't. We've got to remember that. And so I quickly sat down and wrote a will so that I could have some broad brushstrokes of what was going to happen with my money once I kicked the bucket. And that grew then into the idea of having a foundation to support young people learning about critical thinking. And that's where the Skeptics have come in.
Just going back to a bit of your past teaching in Germany, it's interesting that you were teaching science communication. Was that at an undergrad level, or what would be equivalent to an undergrad level for the Australian and New Zealanders?
It was both undergraduates and graduates. We had the broad range there. It went from everything from when you get a supervisor and they dump 50 papers on you and say, read them by next week, that sort of exercise, to argumentation. That was the highest level of how to put together a good argument.
I really think we don't have any sort of formalized education, certainly at an undergraduate level. A lot of that for many of our scientists and academics is something that they either have a bit of a natural performance skill in, or maybe they might get some postgraduate, I would say almost extramural, like external to their employer sort of education. I know the Science Media Center certainly do offer regular workshops for academics or for reporters about science communication. So it's interesting to hear that overseas it's actually considered almost part of undergraduate and postgraduate education as a deliberate choice.
Yeah, the students come with a good grounding in English because they've nearly always had 8 to 10 years of English at school. But coming back to what it's like in New Zealand, I know that there's a Department of Science Communication at the University of Otago, and I've spoken there on occasion as well. And that is basically master's students. But it really is a question of, if you want to study any in science and engineering, you need to read the stuff in English, or you needed to until AI came along.
I guess I'm interested again in terms of the foundation and your sort of interest. It's. I also was reading the website, and it's not just critical thinking. I think there's also an environmental component to that as well, to the goals of your foundation. Is that right?
There is a water safety, which could be meant in two ways. But I'm a keen paddler, and I was a surf lifesaver in an earlier age, and I'm interested in supporting people learning about water safety because that is a very important issue for me.
So you see Skeptics and certainly our conferences as a big part of you achieving, or your foundation achieving, those goals. So why particularly the conferences? What was it that appealed to you about our conferences?
The two things about conferences are, first of all, learning about skepticism as a way of thinking. As I've pointed out to a couple of my friends lately, there are people around the world who will be skeptical about just one thing. They'll be skeptical about evolution, or they'll be skeptical about climate change, but they won't be skeptical about anything else. And what the skepticism is that we have in skeptics groups around the world is skepticism that's applied not in a targeted way to any particular claim, which is actually just denialism, broadly applied across the board. So if we take scientific discoveries, we look at them skeptically, and it turns out that when you look at scientific discovery, they pass the test. If you take pseudoscience discoveries, they don't pass the test. But you still have to apply the same test across the board. And I think that's an important lesson for young people to learn, is it's not that you can be skeptical about just one thing, it's a way of thinking about the world. Because these young people, they'll be learning lots of stuff at school and at university, they'll be going through life, and if they haven't learned about skepticism, they will have a friend who says to them, look, I've discovered a conspiracy. The oil companies are conspiring to make you burn more oil. But then their friend will say to them something like, but I have this little machine here, and this little machine can cause the electrons to go below the ground state or something, and I can get energy out of this for free. And if you're not skeptical, you're going to fall for that scam. Because your friend just wants the money. They have a little machine and it works, but it's not a free energy machine because free energy machines do not exist. They'll say, look, I've got this machine, it's almost working. I just need another 20 grand so that I can bring it to market. And you give them the 20 grand and then they give you reports every now and then about how the machine is progressing. And then the big day comes and they come to you and they're in tears. Oh yes, the oil companies have broken into their house and stolen all of their equipment and now they have to start from scratch. All right? And the cycle just repeats on and on. If you don't know about skepticism, you will fall for that. And that's an important lesson that people shouldn't have to make for themselves, but you can learn about it. And that's why skeptics conferences are important. And I think another thing about the importance of skeptics conferences is that there are some skeptics who deserve to be our heroes, and that's a place where you can go and meet them. For me, that skeptical hero was James Randi. And when I first became a skeptic in my 20s, I had the very fortunate circumstance of actually working with Randi on the German skeptics' dowsing tests. I spent a whole with him. You see, the boxes experiment, which was when I would hide a piece of gold or silver in one of 10 boxes, and then the dowser would come and try to figure out which box I'd hidden the gold and silver in. And of course, you couldn't give the gold and silver to Randi because he would just make them disappear. So they needed someone a little more trustworthy, and they chose me. And I spent a week working with him, and it was a fantastic experience. And as someone in their late 20s, I can say that certainly left an impression on me. But then the amazing thing is that after that, Randy knew who I was. Whenever I went to a conference, yeah, he'd come up to me and greet me and tell stories of the old days and all the rest of it. And that gave me a real lifelong hit of skepticism that I think, when you have heroes like Randy and other skeptical heroes, that can provide an incentive for you to keep on going.
And so, I mean, Randy's passed for many, many years now. So has there been any other skeptical heroes who have filled in that space?
Getting to the age of my former skeptical heroes, aren't I? Now, there certainly are around the place, although they are getting old as well. But I think in the United States, people like Melanie Tracy King, who's a bit younger than I am.
Yeah. She was at her conference a couple of years ago.
Yep. And her thinking is power is a good idea. And I think that the School of Thought, David Mc's organisation, or associated with that organisation, they're two people who are doing very good work for skepticism around the world.
Do you feel that this is something that maybe skeptics organizations worldwide should be moving into? Maybe we should be doing more educating about skepticism, or do you think there is still a place for psychic stings?
I think there is still place for doing investigations and teaching people how to do the investigations. Psychic stings or dowsers or whatever it is you want to test, because that's the only way people are going to get hands-on experience. But I think the education part of it is very important, and that's why I've been in education now for most of my life, and I decided when I retired I wasn't going to stop doing that, but I would move the focus into skepticism and young people, and that's why I've come across the idea of supplying a couple of scholarships. One other point about the whole enterprise, I think, is I also want skepticism to be inclusive. That is, right. There are plenty of isms that we can leave at the door: racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. I just happen to be an old, straight, white guy, but I do see that there's a benefit in having people from different backgrounds coming to skepticism and livening the place up a bit.
And so bringing in more young people will help us.
Yeah, definitely. And the scholarships is to provide some financial incentive to people. I mean, when I die, my old schools and universities will be putting up their hands saying, "Mwah, mwah, mwah." They'll be wanting the money. But I don't think that is a good use of money, just paying people's tuition. But getting them to go to a skeptics conference might be a good idea. The other thing is I wanted to start giving away the money before I kick the bucket. And the idea behind that is that if the thing with the scholarships doesn't work, then we can also, if the thing with the scholarships doesn't work, we can always try out something else. And I want to be able to find something that works and gets young people involved, and that might mean doing outreach. We mentioned Melanie Tracy King. You could invite her to another conference. I'm sure she'd like to come back to New Zealand.
I bet she would.
You could use that to have her talk to schools, for example, and then also pay her fee for doing those presentations. So we've got a couple of options open at the moment. But I just wanted to be happy that I was sure the money was being used for a good purpose and well used before my day of reckoning turns up.
The reason why we're here is, the scholarship that you are offering to the New Zealand Skeptics. So you've been working with committee members John Grady and Daniel Ryan on this. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about how they can get the young person in their lives to apply?
All right. There are 20 scholarships which cover the full entrance fee to the conference. So that's about $250, I think, with the very late tickets. So 20 scholarships available to secondary and tertiary students. Yeah. I think primary students is a bit young at the moment, but we can always revise that. But secondary and tertiary students, they can be under 18, but they will either need consent from their parent or their parent or guardian attending the conference with them. The students have to fill out a fairly simple form with name, telephone number, email, a short statement of 150 to 200 words about why they think visiting the conference would benefit them. If you do have more than 20 people applying, that's what we're going to judge those 20 on. The deadline for filling that out is July the 8th. And we will decide in the week afterwards how many scholarships are being given out. Now, the scholarships don't cover travel, they don't cover accommodation. So you would have to be in or near Christchurch to begin with. But $250 is a major amount of money. And I think that the opportunity to get to know the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, as well as all of the other, or some of the other skeptics at least at the conference, ought to be worth.
Also, even though the scholarship doesn't cover transportation or accommodation, you do get fed while you're at the conference. There'll be a morning and afternoon tea and a lunch each day. So while you are in attendance, you'll be fed and have access to some drinks and plunger coffee.
All right. So yes, you won't be starving.
It's, as I keep on saying, it's a fantastic gift, and we are absolutely stoked that you've chosen our conference. If you know a young person in your life who would like to come to the conference, you can go to our website, skeptics.nz/scholarship, and that'll take you to our Google form where you can begin the application process. You have until July 8th, and we will be advising winners soon after.
All right. Thank you, Bronwyn.
James, it's now your turn. Can you tell us, does degrowth work as a climate change response?
Well, my argument would be that no, it does not. I was motivated to write this article after reading the previous newsletter, where Patrick had included a review of a book called Less is More that was talking about degrowth, and he made a number of claims both about economic growth and what economists think about economic growth that I believe to be incorrect, in my opinion as an economist. Environmental economics is a topic I have studied at university, so I know a fair bit about this part about climate change. I'm not an expert on climate change itself, so I trust the experts when they say that it's a real thing that's happening that we need to do something about. But once we get past that and start having a conversation of how do we actually solve the problem of climate change, that's something I know more about.
So just quickly for a little bit of context, Patrick is a member who wrote to us a while ago and was concerned that we weren't covering climate change enough. And I challenged him by saying, well, why don't you write about climate change for us? He took up the challenge and he's been producing articles for us. It's interesting in that we get a little bit more pushback. He's quite radical in some of his thoughts, and we do get pushback from members occasionally who think that maybe he's saying things that aren't supported by evidence or are maybe going a little bit too far. And this would be one of those for you, James, because you
Yes.
as you say, you have some expertise, you've studied it, and as soon as you saw degrowth, I guess this was like a little bit of a warning sign for you.
Degrowth trades on a number of things that sound very intuitive, but if you understand some of the underlying mechanics, don't really add up.
What do you mean when you say degrowth?
Degrowth is an ideology whose core premise is that for the sake of the environment, it's sometimes associated with climate change, but it actually predates climate change as a big environmental concern. So, for example, there were a lot of people talking about the same basic ideas as degrowth in the 1970s, thinking about things like resource depletion or overpopulation or other environmental problems. And the essential premise of it is economic growth is incompatible with environmental quality, that if we do not curb economic growth, then the environment will just continue to get worse and worse and worse, and eventually humanity will become extinct because we'll overpollute ourselves, or we'll suffer catastrophes caused by overpopulation or some other problem.
So this is about growth of the economy, not the number of humans on the planet.
Indeed, and that's actually a very important part about what we talk about, because there's a particular phrase Patrick used, there cannot be infinite growth on a finite Earth, that was one of the things I wanted to pick apart a little bit, because the way economists think about growth is a little bit different than the way an ecologist, for example, would think about growth. Economic growth is ultimately not about the quantity of resources that one uses. It is about the subjective well-being, effectively, that is created by economic activity. So, theory, if you can keep finding more and more efficient ways of making people's lives better, you actually can get an economic growth. There may be some conceptual limits as to how efficiently we can do that, but those limits don't really have anything to do with the physical size of the planet. It's really just what are the limits of human ingenuity.
Okay, so in a facile way, you think maybe some people would look at economic growth and just think more factories, more pollution, more resources pulled out of the ground, and that this is where the confusion might come from, that they kind of do like a one-to-one between the two?
I do think that is part of it. And sometimes when you have discussions with degrowthers about this, they'll start shifting their definition of growth, and they'll go, oh no, like productivity increases, being more efficient, that's fine, it's only resource consumption we're talking about. But if you're not using the economist's definition of growth, then you can't really throw accusations at economists for us being so foolish as to believe that we can make growth infinite. It's like, we have to be talking about the same thing, or what are we even doing here?
So and again, this was one bit that I don't think was quite explained in your article, that, you know, when we talk about infinite growth, as soon as I hear an infinite, my first thing is to choke on it and go, there are no infinites in the real world. Like this isn't something where but it's not growing to an infinite economy. It just means, like, for as long as, I guess, humanity is around, that the economy just keeps, there's always some growth. Is that what you mean by infinite growth?
Yes, and this is also, like, just another thing, and degrowthers do talk about this idea that economists have this ideological commitment to keeping growth going forever, and for one thing, most of what economists do, well, a lot of what economists do has nothing to do with GDP at all. Macroeconomists think about GDP a lot, but it's not the only thing they care about. Microeconomists, which is what I am, don't really think about GDP at all.
So GDP is gross domestic product, which is kind of just without the cost of it, the amount of stuff that's being produced, or the amount of wealth that's being produced in a country?
Yeah, it's broadly speaking the dollar value of the amount of stuff that's being produced in a time period.
And that would be products and services, presumably, like a lot of Western countries are moving to like more of a service economy.
Yes. Yes, it can be physical goods, it can be services, it includes things like services government provides, it includes goods that are produced for investment. There are ways you can formally define exactly how GDP comes up with, but national accounting is an extremely complicated subfield of economic statistics. There's like a handful of people at Stats New Zealand who do it. So I don't want to try and get into too much detail as to exactly how GDP is calculated, because it's an involved process. But yeah, we're really just talking about the value of the goods and services that are being produced by our economy.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, so the thing is that, you know, economists mostly, when we do care about GDP, what we're mostly doing is looking at the past. We're trying to understand why economic growth speeds up, why it slows down. It's like, nowhere are we trying to project the ultimate infinite end of our economy. Partly because it's just too hard. Trying to predict the future in economics is extremely difficult, and your uncertainties just pile too high once you go more than a few years into the future, so there's just not much use in it. But I will note, this sort of technique where you make a bold claim and then state that people who disagree with you only disagree with you because they have an ideological commitment to the reverse being true, well, that's the sort of thing that pops up in pseudoscience quite a lot. In fact, it is often used by climate change deniers to say, oh, well, climatologists are just ideologically committed to the idea of undoing industrial capitalism, and that's why they go around saying that climate change is real, or that biologists have an ideological commitment to dethroning God, and that's why they teach the theory of evolution. It's like, this is a very common rhetorical technique used by pseudoscientists.
So do you find that a lot of people have this kind of mythical stereotype of the economist as not quite being evil, but, you know, maybe just being like robotic and not caring about people? Is this like a common trope?
It shows up sometimes. To be honest, I suspect most people don't really think about economists at all.
Oh, James, I'm so sorry to hear that.
So how can we make the government pay attention to economists?
Good question. If I come up with anything, I'll let you know. But yeah, so one of the other things I really wanted to talk about in this article, because it's actually very new, and if you're not paying attention to what's going on in the energy sector at the moment, you may not be aware of it, is just how fast renewable energy is starting to spin up. I actually saw something online today, so after this article was written, that says that apparently April 2026 was the first time in history where solar and wind at a global level produced more electricity than natural gas.
Okay. So obviously, I guess coal would be bigger than that still, right?
But nevertheless, a lot of that is, of course, because gas supplies are currently constrained by the whole Iranian situation, because there's a lot of natural gas that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. There is not really any coal that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So
it might be a temporary dip in the natural gas that's caused it rather than the increase in renewables.
At the rate renewables are growing, even if the gas starts flowing again, that cross will just happen again sometime before very much longer, I expect. Because, the growth in solar panels in particular is just massive worldwide. And I had a statistic in there from the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, it's sort of a counterbalance to OPEC, was what it was originally created for, but they worry about a lot of energy stuff, not just oil and gas. And they're talking about doubling of capacity in the next 5 years.
Wow. And this is despite whatever's happening in the States, which obviously is a mess in 2,000 different ways, but part of that is just defunding alternative energy projects, right? But that's not having that much of a dent in this?
Not that much, and a large portion of the reason why is because solar has now passed the threshold in a lot of places where it needs to be subsidized. Texas is actually the state installing the most solar panels in the US these days. It's overtaken California. And even though Texas doesn't actually promote installing solar panels, their government's full of Republicans that aren't particularly interested in environmentally friendly initiatives. It just so happens that that's the most profitable energy type to install at the moment, so they're building a whole bunch. Whereas, because their environmental regulations in general are less restrictive than California's, it's faster and easier to build solar there than it is in California. And that's why they've taken it over.
Okay, that sounds like a really weird situation. A red state, and here they are just hand over fist building solar panels.
Well, they probably have the money to do it from the oil and gas industry. But I guess it's going to be a long time before solar does outpace gas and oil. There's still actually a measure of gas and oil that's needed in terms of the production of solar panels.
A certain amount. There are certainly a whole bunch of things. We're starting to deal with some of the lower hanging fruit when it comes to decarbonising. Electric vehicles have gotten a lot better in the last decade. They're much cheaper. The batteries are much better. So they're really starting to compete with internal combustion engines for short-haul travel. Long-haul travel, slightly different story. Having an electric-powered cargo ship or even trucks for long-haul is going to be a bit harder, because they have to store more energy to be able to travel because they're moving so far. You then start running into harder stuff like industrial process heat. That's a big part of that in New Zealand is milk drying sheds, where you have to dry the milk to powder, so you need to heat the space the milk is in to evaporate the water quickly. And electric heating gets less efficient the hotter the element is, so that's a lot more expensive to electrify. A lot of that is done with coal in New Zealand right now, although some of it's done with geothermal and a couple of other things, but we need a bit more work to do that. Battery technology means storage of a renewable is less of a problem than it used to be, but there's still a bit more to be done there. And then you get to things that aren't really energy at all, but still release carbon, concrete, steel. And that's where some of those things there's a certain amount of fossil fuel that's being used to manufacture things like solar panels. We're going to need to replace that with something too. So I don't want to say, we can kick back and relax, everything is fine. There is still a lot that needs to be done, but in the last few years, it seems more likely than ever that we can actually get there. It's just a matter of how quickly. And that's really why I think degrowth is exactly the wrong way to approach this problem. Our economy is about as unsustainable as it's going to be from a climate change point of view. The last thing we want to do is slow down the rate of innovation or investment, which are both things that drive economic growth. We, if anything, want to speed them up. Try and divert more of our economy's production from consumer goods into new capital goods, like energy infrastructure or research and development or similar things, which, lowers our standard of living a little bit in the short run, but does let us solve this problem more quickly than we otherwise would.
So, Bronwyn, to your point of making the solar panels, I actually looked this up a few months ago, like how much of oil do we use not for fuel? And it's a bit, but it's not a huge amount. So it's about 10% for plastics and other not fuel things, plus another 3 or 4% for making roads, asphalt uses a fair bit, but outside of that, the rest of it, like 85% or so, is all processed into different fuels. So yeah, I don't know whether we're ever going to have alternatives to plastics, but I guess if all we're using oil for is plastics and roads, it's going to last a lot longer.
Well, the other thing to bear in mind there too is that a lot of the carbon for those uses remains bound up in the material. Not all of it, because some of it ends up evaporating off or otherwise being lost, but it's like all the carbon atoms that are inside the plastic, they're not being released into the atmosphere and warming anything up.
Yeah, so you've still got the lack of oil problem, but you're not having the climate change problem from it.
Yes,
Good
or
point.
at least nowhere near as much.
Yeah.
So that helps. But yes, ultimately we probably want to stop doing anything with oil at all, and that does mean coming up with other alternatives to those things.
Fusion. It's all fusion. As soon as we got fusion, we'll be fine, right? It's 50 years away.
I mean, it'd be great. I'll certainly be celebrating the first of, should we ever get commercial fusion power happening. But, it's not an easy thing to do.
No, it turns out not anywhere as easy as we thought it might be 50 years ago. We're still working on it.
Thank you, James. Always a pleasure to have you on your podcast and to be able to pick your brain on some of these trickier environmental and economic topics. I'm now going to hand the proverbial microphone over to Mark. Mark, tell me about this reactionless propulsion rocket drive.
Yeah, so I didn't think there was going to be much in this topic, and the more I was reading, the more it's like, actually, this is fascinating to me. I'm really enjoying reading about it. But it's basically the idea of, can we do space travel and rockets in a fundamentally different way? And there's a problem with rockets. I mean, we, as like the XKCD comic that I put in my article shows, we live in a gravity well. Earth's got a bunch of gravity, and it takes a whole bunch of energy to get off the rock and into orbit, and then to go off even further and do interesting things elsewhere in the solar system. And the gravity on Earth is enough that we have to use a lot of fuel to get off of the planet. And when it comes to modern rockets, and there have been some changes in the fuels that rockets use, but modern rockets, they're still 90% plus by mass is just fuel, just to get the rest, which is not just the payload, it's the rest of the rocket mass, all of that to get it up into space. It takes a lot of fuel, and there are various ways that people are trying to get around it. And in my article, I talked about some of the weird and wonderful futuristic ideas, like space elevators and a launch loop that it's almost like a ride you go to at a theme park, one of the roller coasters, where it kind of goes round a track and then like part of the track goes upwards and it just flings something into space. And not all of these are totally theoretical. There's a company in the States, I believe they're based, called Spin, and they are trying to build this device where they've just got an arm that is pivoted in the middle, and it just turns round in circles, so it's kind of like two clock hands opposite each other, and they stick a rocket on one end and a counterweight on the other. They spin it up for hours, making it go faster and faster. Inside, the whole thing's contained in a vacuum, and then they let it go and see how far up into the atmosphere they can fling it, while simultaneously dropping the weight downwards so that they don't have any misalignment of mass and end up destroying their own machine. And then from as far up as it goes, rocket boosters kick in and try and get it the rest of the way into orbit. That might be the topic of another article, because it looks like that company is full of crap, and that, the thing they're trying to do is never going to be possible, which is interesting. But outside of this, outside of these kind of ideas that are either going to be happening in the next few hundred years, or that are just going to use a bunch of investors' money, and not manage this, there are people that think that there might be a fundamentally different way of getting into space and or once you're moving yourself around. And these are generally known as reverse drive. So the standard way that all of these things are working, the way that rockets work, is action and reaction. So basically, you shove something out the bottom of a rocket and it pushes the rocket upwards. So Newton's third law of motion. And oh, hang on, I've got a bit of paper being shown to me by Katrina that says Tsiolkovsky. That's my dude, is it? I tried to look up how to pronounce it, but yeah. So there, she's gonna make me talk about this. I tried avoiding it. I tried not to talk about it because I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. And here I am having to talk about Tsiolkovsky and his rocket equation, which basically says that to change the velocity of something, it's all about the natural log of the ratio of the start and end mass of the rocket and the velocity of what's coming out. And so basically, this is why we have to use so much fuel, is because you get diminishing returns with this. And you need to be going pretty fast in order to be able to get out of the Earth's atmosphere. I mean, you could go really slowly if you had infinite fuel, right? You could move up at like 1 meter an hour and just keep going, but you don't have infinite fuel. So you've got to get up quickly, which means that you just need to burn fuel quickly. And it takes a lot of fuel. But anyway, thank you for helping me to pronounce that, Katrina. That was awesome. Back to our regular programming. Reactionless drive. So this idea is that we don't have to worry about, what was his name? Show me the paper again. Quick. We don't have to worry about Tsiolkovsky's equations if we can find a way of putting rockets into orbit that doesn't need us to shove stuff out the back of the rocket. If it's not an action-reaction, if we can get an action without the reaction, not a problem. We're not carrying fuel anymore. We're going to be absolutely fine. And this is something like I've known for a while about one which is called the EM drive or the M drive. But when I looked into it, it turns out that all the way back to the 50s, all the way back before we were throwing stuff in space, there was the Dean drive, and the Dean drive is the first of these reactions. The idea being that you have some axles and you put weights on them, but the weights are asymmetric, and because of this it causes vibrations, and apparently the device should be able to climb up its own vibrations. It's the best description I could find. It made no sense to me whatsoever.
The thing that struck me, Mark, reading this article, is how many of these drives resemble sort of perpetual motion machines in their own way. Which, I mean, they are violating the laws of physics, because a drive, with one notable exception, would violate Newton's third law of motion, is that we're going to throw a bunch of little complicated things that are all spinning around, and somehow we're going to cheat the system this way, when it seems like that's a really good way of setting up a system to create a bunch of error, which can make it look like you're getting something you're actually not.
Yeah, and they definitely with perpetual motion machines, you'll often see they'll get close to unity, they'll get close to 100% efficiency, and so then they try and bolt something else onto it, right, to try and get a little bit more efficiency or pump some heat back in this direction with the hope that eventually they can get to over 100%. And again, of course, with physics, you absolutely can't. But yeah, these things, the machines look impressive. They look like they would be real physics machines. So the next one after the Dean drive was the Byfield-Brown effect, which was really interesting because it's named after two people, one of which had nothing to do with it. So Thomas Brown came out with it, and one of his lecturers back in the day was called Byfeld, and so he just threw his name in there as well, basically stolen valor, and just went, hey, it's both of us, not just me. You can trust this guy, you know him. But this one basically is a capacitor. So the idea is that you have two plates, positive and a negative, and you put a charge across them like a normal capacitor for those that understand these electronic weirdy things, but you have an asymmetry again, like with the Dean machine and the vibrations. This time you have an asymmetry where you make the cathode bigger than the anode, And the idea is that because of this asymmetry, it produces a force in one direction. One of the interesting things about this is the devices, some of them look like UFOs. And like when I was a very young skeptic and getting into some of these crazy ideas, a friend of mine got into it. A friend of mine got into like over unity and free energy, and maybe this was how UFOs went. He was a scientist and fairly skeptical, but he was still fascinated by it, and he dragged me into it. And I used to watch these videos of people making these lifters like out of tin foil and basically applying electricity across them and claiming that they were hovering and that this was because of some kind of anti-gravity effect. And all of this was the Biefeld-Brown effect that they were claiming, and this was the cool thing in kind of the 80s and the 90s. But this went away a little bit. I mean, it's still around, but it was less dominant in the 2000s because of the EM drive. So when the EM drive came out, this one actually looked like it had more promise. So it you know, like it was almost a proper scientist making it. It was a copper cone. You fire microwaves into it. It's an enclosed cone, so the microwaves bounce around a lot. And then something happens. The people that made it never quite knew what or described what they thought the theory was behind it, just that the result was thrust. So chuck in microwaves, wait for a while, you get thrust. And as you said, James, basically there are these error margins and there are these sources of error when you make something complicated. And this is very much what happened with the EM drive. With this one, there were different tests that were done over the years, and those tests had a whole range of different reasons why they were probably measuring something other than reactionless thrust. So there were thermal gradients that were causing some kind of force to happen. At one point, they think that the machine was interacting with the Earth's magnetic field and power cables that are around the device. So interacting with the Earth's magnetic field, it was basically thrust, right? So electricity, magnetism, movement. The three come together. So they had two of them in this device, and they got movement as the third part of that. But it's not the kind of thing that's useful in space because you won't have all of that in space. And what else did they get? Warping fasteners, apparently, and stray air currents. So all of these, because often the way they set these devices up is they're basically made so light, and they're made on kind of such a light bearing that they can spin, because they don't actually try and lift the things. They have them so they kind of rotate horizontally. And as long as they can measure some kind of movement, that's their thrust. And when you do that, an air current will be enough to blow this thing round in a circle. And at that point you claim, hey, we measured some thrust. It's a tiny bit, but it was reactionless. Ionic wind is a part of this because of these capacitor designs. What you can end up with when you have a capacitor is that it charges the air particles. It ionizes them. So it strips an electron off, or it adds an electron. And either way, basically, then they start getting attracted in one direction. They start moving. They make a wind. And the wind makes this little very light machine move. So the latest one, the reason why I wrote this article was a few days ago, there was an article that came out about the Exodus propulsion drive. And this is the latest iteration of reactionless drives, made by a guy that used to work for NASA, and he worked on electrostatics at NASA, which is what his drive is based on. But his electrostatic work at NASA is fundamentally different. At NASA, he was making sure rockets didn't blow up, because electrostatics, which can cause sparks, not good when you don't want them in a rocket. So around fuel, around sensitive electronics, sparks are not a good thing. And so his job was to make sure that these rockets were grounded in the right way, that basically they didn't have any kind of electrostatic buildup that could cause problems. Awesome work. Apparently he was really good at it. Like, he co-founded a NASA lab to do this, the Electrostatics and Surface Physics Laboratory. But as part of this work, he thought that he started seeing an electrostatic force which was reactionless. And so now he's gone off and set up his own lab, the Exodus Propulsion Lab, where him and others are working towards making a new reactionless drive. And it's exactly the same thing. Like, there are so many red flags here, basically, that what he's trying to do is not happening. I mean, the first thing I point out in my article is basically that he's made a claim that he can overcome gravity, that the amount of force that he got was the equivalent to lift the device. Even though, again, he didn't lift the device, it rotated horizontally around an axis, but he claims that the amount of force was enough to lift it. It wasn't. Like, the very central core of the device is like a tiny metal foil grid that he's built. And that weighs less than a gram. And he made enough force that could lift less than a gram. But he ignored the frame that was built in, and he ignored the kilograms of electronics that was producing the electricity that was being run through this thing. It couldn't lift any of that whatsoever. It could barely lift itself if it was doing what he claims it was doing. And I don't think it was even doing that because, as James has pointed out, it defies physics. And if you're going to defy physics, you'd better be really fucking sure that you're doing it. Sorry to swear there, but you've got to be so sure. You can't just be like, oh, we saw a result that looks like we're doing this and we think we've invented new physics. But this guy's run with it. Basically, Bueller, and I haven't heard any Bueller jokes yet, but surely there's something there in that. But Bueller has gone out talking publicly saying things like this. The most important message to convey to the public is that a major discovery occurred. This discovery of a new force, massive claim, is fundamental in that electric fields alone can generate a sustainable force onto an object and allow center of mass translation of said object without expelling mass. So it's a reactionless drive. Basically, it's pushing in one direction without anything happening in the other direction. And I think it's going to be like the others. I think it's going to be like every reactionless drive that's preceded it. There will be some kind of experimental error. There will be something that's not been considered, not been taken into account, and that will be providing this tiny piece of thrust that he's causing. And it's not a new type of physics. It's just going to be that they've not done the experiment well enough. They're doing it in a vacuum. That's a good start. So now ionic wind shouldn't be a thing. But as I said before, with the electric cables and the magnetic field and the heat and stuff like this, there's a whole bunch of other ways in which they can very easily get anomalous results that aren't just ionic wind. So he's compensated for one thing and made sure that's not what they're getting. There's a bunch of other stuff that they just haven't taken into consideration. And sadly, I don't think they're measuring anything real. As I say at the end of my article, I'd love it if this was real. I'd love it if we could, even if it's only a tiny bit of force, like, when it comes to interstellar travel and that kind of thing, over time it would build up. You could do cool stuff with this, even if it's not going to be big enough to lift you out of the Earth's gravity field. At least you could do stuff bizzing around the solar system and other things. But we're stuck. It seems like, from what I've read, we are stuck, and you have to shove stuff out of one end to get the rest of it to move in the other direction.
Well, strictly speaking, there is one way to produce reactionless thrust.
Yeah, you did mention that earlier. What is it?
Light pressure. So normally this is thought about with solar sails, because under relativity, light doesn't have mass, but it does have some momentum, and so that's how solar sails work. By catching light, they can actually move, because the photons are actually pushing.
Yeah, so you can get those little devices, can't you, where they're the little spinning wheel, and it's got, like, black on one side and white on the other, and photons bounce off of the white bit?
The white's more reflective, I believe is how it works. So you could build a spaceship with a giant laser on it and just fire the laser, and you would get reactionless thrust. Two small problems. One is the energy required is absolutely massive, because it's a very inefficient way of pushing anything. And the other problem is that the heat that power will generate will vaporize the spaceship.
So just minor.
Yeah, just small problem. I guess theoretically, if you could come up with a really cold operating laser, you might be able to make an absolutely tiny little satellite that could be powered by a laser or something. But yeah, no, there's a reason why nobody's seriously investigating this as an option. But strictly speaking, it is a form of reactionless thrust that physics
All right,
allows.
so photons are a way of doing it. I do remember years ago there being a device where they had, like, it was a little bit like the EM drive, where they had this little metal device, maybe 6 inches tall, and in the bottom of it was a cavity that they could fire a laser in from below, and then this thing would go up into the air when you fire a laser, like a pulsed laser. But what it turns out was happening was every time they pulsed the laser into the bottom of it, the laser would bounce around inside, heat up the air, and the air would pop out. You could hear a little explosion. And then once the laser turned off, the air would rush back in, and they would repeat. Another laser firing for 100 milliseconds. The air would heat up and pop out, and it was like propulsion by warming the air repeatedly. And it was cool to see, but again, I don't think that's a reactionless drive.
No, because it's ejecting mass.
Exactly, and it only has limited use, because when you've got no atmosphere, it ain't working anymore, because there's nothing to heat up.
I guess you could do it in a vacuum by firing the laser and having the laser essentially boil off the outer surface of your spacecraft, and because that would then be pushed away, it would then push forward. I don't know if I'd want to do that. I think you might run out of spaceship if you're not careful.
Yeah, it would definitely over time be a problem. Yeah, that was the other thing I wrote about briefly in my article, was just about the cool new drives that we do have. And I think, Katrina, you might talk a little bit about how some of these are being used that you mentioned in your article. But we have ion drives and stuff like this, which the idea is, as I said, it's either basically more mass difference or more velocity of the particles. And the more you can crank those up, the better thrust you get. And so stuff like ion drives is just trying to accelerate the particles as much as possible before ejecting them, just to get more bang for your buck. And those, some of them are already being used. I think the ion drive is being used in anger on a few satellites. It does work, but there are other versions as well that are pretty cool. But none of them are reactionless. They still are. This is all just action and reaction.
Yeah, sounds like you need a space elevator, really.
Yeah, we've gone past the space elevator. The skyhook, they're talking about building one on the moon as well, having a moon hook for getting stuff down to the moon and back, which is kind of cool.
Oh, yeah, just throw up a grappling hook and you're right.
Yeah.
The materials science problems of doing it on the moon are a lot
It's the
less,
odd thing.
because
What you need a nanobot.
Right. Yeah,
to
apparently for the moon,
maintain-
existing materials are fine. We could build it now if we had the money. If our economy had grown that much that we could afford it.
Right.
I think that's a perfect segue to our final segment of the night. Katrina, your bedside sci-fi reading has inspired several articles from you as of late. You wrote about the Kessler syndrome. Do you think that reactionless drives are going to be contributing further to that issue?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, this is a sci-fi book about space elevator, which I haven't finished reading because it is my bedside reading, which means I fall asleep very quickly reading it with it on my face. And this one's called First Descent. It's a sci-fi book by Douglas Phillips. It is about a space elevator, but part of the premise about it is that essentially humanity's been locked out of space because of something called Kessler syndrome. And so basically this is sometimes called an ablation cascade. It's basically when stuff starts crashing into each other in orbit, it hits other stuff, and that hits more stuff, and so you have sort of a exponential cascade of stuff crashing into each other until basically you can't put anything up there without it getting obliterated by all the space junk that's flying around. So this is one theory, is that, we're going to have a Kessler syndrome or Kessler event, and that's going to lead to Kessler syndrome, where basically we cannot use our orbits, particularly the ones that sort of mid-level orbits where things stay up there a long time because we've got too much space junk up there. And so the views on this go all over the map. And there's certainly one view that, oh no, a satellites get knocked out, we'll lose the... And that is just... I'm sorry, but there's just so much going wrong with that. So in this book, we have people there going, hey, wow, I'm the news media, I'm going to be this down to earth. My cell phone's still working because we're really close to the satellites. And I'm like... You mean the satellites that are crashing into you right now? But also, the internet is mainly not up in space. It's mainly in undersea cables, under the oceans, and then it goes in little cables into people's houses. So 99% of the internet traffic is not up there. Also, you can't use those satellites up there from a normal phone. You need a satellite phone or something. Your phone is not connected to those satellites. So if you are in the International Space Station and you've got a normal phone with a normal, telecom connection, you're probably not going to be able to use that connection up in outer space. It's not a coverage zone for telecom. So
Elon Musk's internet is up in space. I think people care too much about that one.
No, I mean, the point is if that got knocked out, we wouldn't lose internet on Earth, right? Some people on farms like Daniel would lose internet and be very upset about it, or they'd have to go back to, dial-up speeds. But most people, the world would have internet.
Yeah, I have to imagine the Kessler syndrome is going to have to get really bad for the satellites to start damaging the undersea cables.
The Russians will get there first, just dragging anchors along the bottom, I'm sure.
And so there's a bunch of conspiracy theories around the Kessler syndrome, and as you'd expect. So some of them are, this is just a made-up thing so that we can get more military stuff in space and have anti-satellite weapons and all of that. So basically, big story that's been made up so that we can militarize space. Okay, that's one of them. And another one is that actually Kessler syndrome has already happened, and there's certain orbits that can't be used because there's too much junk in there, and someone is hiding the truth, and that launches are already been restricted, and these satellite crashes that we haven't been told about, and the tracking data for bases for base junk are being tampered with. So what you're seeing on these trackers is not what's really happening. But I guess the issue is this is assuming there's some joined up entity that knows everything and is hiding everything. And the reality is you've got amateur astronomers out there, universities, companies, tracking these things that have got things in space. So they all have to be somehow agreeing and lying about it to conceal a Kessler event. It would be a big deal.
That's all I know of is in the 90s I went to visit RAF Fylingdale, and that was I think it was a US owned facility in the UK, and the US and the UK do work together tracking these things. And Fylingdale was very cool. It was like a pyramid-y thing that had hundreds of small dishes on each side, and they could either group them all together and track something very small, or have each of them track something separate. And when I went in there, they did have like the very big screen that would show you the hundreds and hundreds of devices that were being tracked in space. But obviously, this was the early days. This was before Musk started putting satellites up and everything else, when it was a lot easier to track these things. And I think they could go down to like 5 centimeters big or something like that they could track, which was pretty impressive. But yeah, as you say, it's not unified. There's not one global organization that's doing all of this.
Yeah, they're just giving too much credit to people to work together to keep a lie like that out of it. But it's all over the map. It's from, syndrome doesn't exist to it's already happened. So there's not really any consistency there. Another one is that, there's a nation that wants to do this so that they can basically seize authoritarian control space. So they want this to happen to reduce people's options. So yeah, few different theories. And then of course there's a UFO theory that they're calling these collisions and these objects in space junk, but it's really UFOs, or it's alien activity, aliens moving things around in space. So I guess, you need a UFO thing if you're going to list conspiracy theories. It's got to be in there. But the other thing that's coming up as well, this is our new UFO equivalent conspiracy theory thing, is AI, artificial intelligence. Now you've got to have an artificial intelligence conspiracy theory. So now it's not a government that's doing it, it's artificial intelligence, whatever that is creating the debris deliberately as some kind of self-preservation. It wants to lock human beings out of space to somehow self-preserve itself. I don't know how the logic on that works, but...
So maybe we get Earth and they get the rest of the universe?
No, well, maybe you keep the humans here so that they can clean your hard drive, but these things are going to make as much sense as they make. So, and there's another one which is quite extreme. They're going to get so much junk up there, it's all going to get stuck together, and the Earth is just going to have a giant shell around it of metal. But see, the orbits move at different speeds, everything moves at different speeds, like to keep it all stuck together is again a bit of a physics issue. I think it's highly unlikely that everything's going to stay stuck together in a big giant metal shell.
Like accidentally making the wrong Dyson sphere. Oops.
Yeah, that's not how Dyson spheres are supposed to work. So for those that don't know what a Dyson sphere is like where you surround the sun and harness the energy from the sun that would usually dissipate from your star and then somehow use that. But obviously putting a big shell around your own planet, suffocating.
Hey, surely it would solve like our climate warming, wouldn't it?
You would call that an own goal. There's a science debate, and so I guess some scientists sort of think, well, it could be a little bit closer than you think, and some of them are going the other direction. But I guess overall it's landing that nearly everyone that's studying the science of orbital debris or involved in monitoring agrees that a collision cascade can occur under the conditions. So, but that's not whether it can occur, it's just about the timescale. So it could take a really long time. We've got stuff in low Earth orbit that tends to just deorbit, if you know what I mean. So that's less time that it's up in space. So it's less of an issue, but we still have things falling to Earth. In terms of the reversibility, what orbit it's in. So those are all the conversations they're having. They've got great tracking tools out there where you can see a lot of it. There's one outfit that are tracking it, and I was listening to them talk, and it was like, yep, if something gets within 6 kilometres, it will turn a different colour, so you can actually see it. You can go on the web yourself and find this, and you can see the stuff that is within 6 kilometres, which has got a chance of, I guess, crashing into something else. And they use that. They have been more and more having to move things around. So we didn't used to have to worry about that, but now it's a bit more like your civil aviation sort of tracking. They're having to do that in space now much more. They're also having to think about the governance of space and putting things up there and designing things so that stuff doesn't stay up there. So if you're putting something up into space, what's your plan to deorbit it? Also, if it's a bit explodey, draining, any fuel out at the end of life, or draining batteries, those kind of things, so that if you stop using something and something crashes into it, it's less likely to explode and then hit more things. And so I think that's the thinking that's going on. So I guess scientists are less worried about an imminent satellite apocalypse, and that's probably a bit exaggerated by the media. And most of low Earth orbit is not close to cascade because it falls back. But the operational risk is getting worse, so it's just going to get more naggy and more expensive and more tricky to have things in space because there's more stuff up there, but not an immediate risk of loss of access to space. The consensus, people are going different ways, but that is less likely to be an issue. And there are some efforts to remedy this now, so we're not all just sitting going, it'll be fine, we'll just navigate around things. There's some work around, well, can we actually actively remove some of the debris that's up in space? Really expensive, kind of, you might be taking out something the size of a bolt, and it, costing $1 million to get something up there to do that. So I guess it's just working out, well, what is the cost benefit for that? But if we can make satellites leave orbit faster, if we can do better tracking management, if we can get those dangerous objects out, then that all helps. And so I guess the debates, whether active removal of is necessary, and whether we can stop the long-term instability of some of the orbital regions, the ones that we need for our satellites. And so low Earth orbit's probably going to be okay. A lot of those, like the Elon Musk satellites, are in low Earth orbit, so probably Daniel's internet connection will probably be all right. It might be one of the last to go unless something comes from on high and knocks something off its perch. But basically there's a constellation, so Elon's network is a constellation of satellites, so you lose one, there's still quite a lot of satellites up there. So it's not like he's just got 3 satellites up there servicing the Earth. There's quite a lot of satellites in low Earth orbit. So yes, that obviously creates more space junk, but also lowers the risk of one gets taken out that it's fatal to farm internet.
So this debris cascade, I guess, is quite a slow thing. Like, if it happened quickly. So the thing in my mind is always the movie Gravity. 2013, Sandra Bullock, you end up with this cascade in low Earth orbit of things hitting other things and then just debris flying all around the planet and destroying the space station that she's on as an astronaut. And I remember at the time looking it up and going, it can't happen. Like, it doesn't work like that. And it would take tens and tens of thousands of devices in space to do that. But then, come where we are now, just over 10 years later, and just the sheer number of small satellites that are being launched, it definitely feels a lot less far-fetched now. But I guess given that low Earth orbit isn't so much of a worry, I'm presuming that part of that basically is that, this isn't something that happens immediately. That's something that's going to... The cascade will happen over months and years. And in that time, obviously... In low Earth, as you say, they deorbit, they burn up, right? Whereas it's higher up that won't happen anywhere near as quickly, and where they stay around for longer and can be more of a problem.
Yeah, I mean, higher Earth orbit, I think my understanding is they could be stuck up there hundreds of years, so it's just not good. But there is a thing called crash clock, and they're trying to calculate, it stands for something fancy, but they're trying to calculate, if one satellite fails, what's the chances that will cause more collisions and that kind of thing. So you can have events like a solar storm or something, and that can actually knock a satellite out so it can be functioning perfectly. It gets hit by the radiation sort of from a solar storm, and boom, it's not working anymore. And so you now cannot manoeuvre that. So you need to manoeuvre things around it, if you know what I mean. The more stuff we get up there, the more issues we have, and the more stuff that we get up there that's dead, that we cannot move, that limits the option. So they are tracking that. So, that could happen. It's, there is a little bit of split of scientists there going, well, there's a risk of this. But it's more likely that it's just going to get really tricky than it'll just sort of go off once. But, there's something. It won't take out the internet. We did have Kessler syndrome. It's going to mean that getting out into space is going to be quite dangerous. So I guess that's what we're thinking about. Are we going to get trapped on Earth? The first thing that pops in my head, but we don't go anywhere anyway. We hardly ever leave. We're not doing enough. We need to go and see the universe. But yeah.
First thing that popped into my head is having to attach cow catchers to the front of rockets so that you can kind of barge all the satellites out of the way as you go up through orbit.
Yeah, and some of the strategies to get rid of objects are a bit like that. There's some where you kind of blast them and with rockets and manoeuvre them, and then there's the other ones that are a bit more no touch and or poke them and things like that.
Can we just have one large mass, like a mini moon that just gravitationally attracts everything to it? Just have that orbiting?
Yeah, but there might be a certain point where you start to get tides or worse,
Well, there is this thing called the Roche limit, where if a mass gets too close to a larger mass, it gets ripped to pieces and converted into a ring. So the moon might actually make things worse.
Okay, that would be
I'm pretty
just a
sure
lot
I
of
saw
debris.
that movie as well. There was one where the moon came close or something, and it was everything earthquake. It just didn't seem good.
Okay. Fraught with danger, space.
I think we forget how dangerous space is. Just because everything's kind of worked out on Earth doesn't mean it's human friendly up there.
All right. Thank you for that, Katrina. It's now time for Membership Corner. Before we sign off for another fortnight, just letting you know about some things that are going to be happening for skeptics, at least in Wellington and Auckland, this coming month. Next Wellington Skeptics in the Pub will be on June 26th at 6 p.m. at the Intercontinental Hotel. The Auckland Skeptics in the Pub will be on July 7th at the Dyson Fork starting at 6:30 p.m. We also still have conference tickets for our annual conference in Christchurch with the standard prices now in effect. Visit our website, conference.skeptics.nz, and then follow the link to the Humanitics page. Mark, just for our audience one more time, do you want to share the webpage for the scholarship?
skeptics.nz/scholarship. And yeah, it's definitely worth going to our conference because all four of us here on the call will be there. So you get to meet us all and have lunch with us or something if you just want to have a chat. We could reenact a podcast for you all as well.
I think this might be the year that we won't be doing our live podcast recording, but that's because the SGU will be are planning to do a recording on Saturday. So we don't want to bore you with two podcasts.
Yeah, we'll just do an impromptu lunch one where you can talk to us and it'll feel like listening to a podcast.
Now, on that note, waiting for a bit of an update, but the SGU are hosting their own event on the evening of July 31st. This event will not be included in the weekend conference pass, so you just need to head over to the SGU website to get your tickets for their Friday night extravaganza. There are a limited number of seats for that event, so get in and get your tickets quick. Finally, we have a shout out for the team at Degrowth. Tickets for their 2026 conference in October, also in Christchurch, are going to be on sale in the coming weeks. In the lead up to the conference, they are running a campaign to fund their own scholarships to help cult survivors attend the conference, just so that cult survivors can network with professionals and meet other cult survivors.
It seems like from the last conference that it's a really valuable resource for people that have come out of cults. I think most of the people there had been in at least one cult, and there was a lot of networking, a lot of just meeting other people who've been through the same kind of thing you have. So yeah, getting those people that can't afford it to get there and meet other people that have been through the same, very, very valuable.
So if you're keen to donate to this cause, visit decult.net and follow the links that will set you towards the donation page. Their current goal is $10K, and as of June 10th, they've raised about 46% of that amount, or $4,600. Anything that they fund beyond that $10K will just be going to help some of the speakers, helping them with travel and accommodation. So helping them cover some of their costs for coming in and giving some of their time. So that's pretty cool. And we'll be hopefully having Anka on to join us on the podcast in July.
Awesome.
And she'll give us a good update about all the stuff that's been happening. But until then, if you have any comments, queries, kudos, questions, or concerns, please email us at news@skeptics.nz or podcast@skeptics.nz. That's all now for this episode. That's all for this episode of the Nah podcast. We will be back with more skeptical news in a fortnight. Kakite.
Tsiolkovsky.
Don't show me up by pronouncing it so well. See you guys.
Bye.